A cartoonist walked into a Hollywood office in 1987 to pitch one idea, panicked in the lobby, and invented a different one on the spot. The character he sketched became a word in the Oxford English Dictionary and the most analyzed figure in American television history. This is the entire story of Homer Simpson, The Waiting Room. Matt Groening did not plan Homer Simpson. He planned something else entirely, walked into a Hollywood building in 1987 with a pitch he had spent years preparing, sat down in the lobby to wait, and realized in the space of roughly 15 minutes that he was about to make a mistake he could not take back. What he drew instead, on the spot, with no preparation and no guarantee that anyone in the room he was about to enter would want it, became the most commercially successful animated character in television history. James L. Brooks had noticed it. Brooks was one of the most successful television producers in America, responsible for series like The Mary Tyler Moore Show and Taxi and Terms of Endearment, and he had reached out to Groening about adapting Life in Hell for a series of animated short segments on a variety program he was producing for the Fox network called The Tracy Ullman Show. The meeting had been arranged. The pitch was scheduled. Groening had prepared something, and then, sitting in the lobby outside Brooks's office, waiting for the meeting to begin, he had a realization that changed the direction of his career and, without any exaggeration, the direction of American television. The realization was about ownership. Adapting Life in Hell for television would almost certainly require signing over some portion of the rights to the characters to the production company, which would mean that the strip, the thing Groening had spent nearly a decade building, the characters he had drawn from his own anxieties and his own observations, would no longer be entirely his. He had not fully processed this implication until the moment he was sitting in the lobby with the pitch materials in his hands, and once he processed it, the pitch he had prepared became untenable. He was not willing to risk Life in Hell. He would need something else. What followed, in the 15 or 20 minutes before the meeting began, was one of the most consequential pieces of improvisation in the history of American entertainment. Groening drew a family, a father, a mother, 3 children. He gave them names taken from his own life, from his own household growing up in Portland, because names were the one thing he could produce without time or preparation. His own father was named Homer. His own mother was named Margaret, called Marge. His younger sisters were named Lisa and Maggie. The father in the drawing took his father's name. The mother took his mother's name, adjusted slightly. The daughters took his sisters' names directly. For the son, Groening decided that naming a character after himself was too obvious a move, and instead scrambled his own name into something new, an anagram of brat that sounded like a real name, while carrying the specific energy of someone who would spend a decade on merchandise being cited by parents as a corrupting influence on their children. The boy became Bart. The drawings were rough. Groening has described them himself as crude, done quickly, with no expectation that they would ever be seen, exactly as he drew them, operating under the reasonable assumption that professional animators would receive his sketches and clean them up into something presentable before they were ever shown to anyone or committed to actual animation. The animators did not clean them up. They traced directly over what Groening had drawn, which meant that the specific imperfections of a sketch, done in 15 minutes in a lobby, became permanent features of characters that would be watched by hundreds of millions of people across 35 years of television. The shapes were preserved as designed under pressure. The Simpson family's visual identity was an accident of efficiency. The father in those drawings was not yet the Homer Simpson that anyone born after 1989 would recognize. The character Groening sketched in that lobby was built around a different kind of energy from the one the character eventually developed into. He was angrier. Groening himself described the early Homer as a barely controlled cauldron of rage, a man whose relationship to his family was organized primarily around exasperation, around the specific fury of someone who believed his life was not what it should have been, and who could not quite identify the precise cause of that gap between expectation and reality. The warmth that would come to define the character in the classic seasons, the moments where Homer's love for his family broke through his selfishness and his stupidity and his impulsiveness and became something genuinely affecting, was not present in the character as originally drawn. What was present was the frustration, which would remain, and the appetite, which would remain. remain, and the hairline, which would remain, and the name. Homer was named after Groening's father, Homer Philip Groening, who was, by his son's account, an almost entirely different kind of person from the character who eventually bore his name. The real Homer Groening was a filmmaker and a cartoonist himself, someone his son described as a huge inspiration, a man who had demonstrated to a young Matt Groening that a creative life was not only possible but sustainable. He had served in the Second World War as a pilot, which is about as far from the Springfield nuclear power plant's Sector 7G as it is possible to get while still existing in the same century. Groening has said directly that his father was nothing like Homer Simpson, that the name was taken without the biography, that the inspiration was personal without being biographical. The real Homer Groening was the kind of father his son wanted to celebrate. The cartoon Homer Simpson was the kind of father his son wanted to satirize. The name connected them. Everything else was invention. The name also carried a literary weight that Groening was almost certainly aware of when he chose it, even if he chose it primarily because it was his father's name rather than because of the ancient Greek poet. Homer the poet is the attributed author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, two of the oldest and most enduring pieces of narrative literature in the Western tradition, the foundational texts of a culture's understanding of heroism and fate and the specific kinds of suffering that men bring upon themselves through pride and stubbornness and the refusal to accept what the world is actually offering them. Homer Simpson is not heroic in that tradition. He is the anti-epic, the ordinary man whose struggles are not the stuff of legend, but the stuff of Tuesday, whose relationship to fate is primarily expressed through the specific sound of mild, self-directed frustration that would eventually be written in scripts as an annoyed grunt and rendered by his voice actor as something the world would come to know as dope. The physical design of the character that emerged from those lobby sketches embedded a private signature that Groening placed into the drawing without initially realizing it would be a problem. When he designed Homer's hairline and ear, the shapes he drew happened to encode his own initials, the M of his first name visible in the shape of the remaining hair above the temples, and the G of his surname visible in the shape of the ear. He caught this and redesigned the ear to remove the monogram, deciding it would be too distracting for viewers who noticed it. The redesigned ear is what appears in every episode of the television series. When Groening draws Homer for fans in person, however, he still draws the ear as a G, the private signature restored for individual copies of the character, rather than for the broadcast version that the rest of the world watches. The meeting went well. Brooks and his colleagues approved the concept and commissioned the animated shorts. The Simpsons family, drawn in a lobby in 15 minutes, was greenlit for production as a series of interstitial segments to appear between sketches on The Tracey Ullman Show. What began airing in April of 1987, roughly 2 months after Groening had sketched the family in the waiting room, was technically the debut of Homer Simpson on television, though the version of Homer who appeared in those 48 short segments over 3 years bore a complicated relationship to the character who would emerge on the other side of the transition to a full series. The shorts were produced under conditions that shaped the character's early development in ways that the later series would both build on and depart from significantly. The animation was limited by budget and by the compressed runtime of the segments, which typically ran between 60 seconds and 2 minutes, not long enough to establish anything beyond the broadest strokes of character and situation. Homer in the shorts was frequently physical in his comedy, a character whose humor came from exasperation rendered visible, and from the specific chaos of a household where everyone's impulses were ungoverned by any particularly strong sense of what was appropriate. He yelled, he grabbed, he made decisions that were obviously wrong in ways that the other characters could not always prevent. The cauldron of rage Groening had described was the organizing principle, and the comedy of the shorts asked viewers to find something recognizable in the spectacle of a family trapped in close quarters with someone someone whose emotional regulation was perpetually inadequate. Dan Castellaneta was the actor hired to voice Homer from the beginning, a member of the comedy troupe that had already been assembled for the Tracey Ullman Show, and who would remain the character's voice for every episode of every season across the full history of the series. An unbroken relationship between performer and character that now spans nearly 4 decades. Castellaneta's approach to the character in the early period was still being developed, still searching for the specific register the voice would eventually inhabit. The voice in the shorts was pitched slightly higher than it would later become, slightly more generically comedic, and slightly less defined as a specific personality expressed through sound. The specific quality that the voice would develop over the first several seasons of the full series, the particular combination of hopefulness and incompetence and unguarded feeling that made Homer's voice recognizable on a frequency below conscious identification, was not yet fully present. The character and the performance were both still becoming what they were going to be. What the lobby sketch and the Tracey Ullman shorts established, however crudely and however incompletely, was the basic architecture around which everything would eventually be built. A man, overweight, underqualified, working a job beneath his actual capacities, while being simultaneously unsuited for any job that would require sustained application of those capacities. A family he loved in ways he could not always articulate and that his behavior frequently contradicted. A town that was neither a specific real American city nor an entirely fictional one, but something located in the productive middle distance between those two possibilities. Recognizable as a place without being any particular place. A voice that was still finding its specific sound, but that was already committed to a certain quality of openness, of making itself vulnerable to being heard as foolish, that few comedic voices in American television had been willing to sustain across an entire series rather than as a recurring bit. The lobby where Homer Simpson was drawn had been a last resort and a solution simultaneously, a place where a cartoonist too protective of one creation invented another in the time between parking his car and walking into a meeting. The family he drew has since appeared in more than 790 episodes of television, 1 theatrical film, and a quantity of merchandise sufficient to have generated revenues measured in the tens of billions of dollars. The name his real father carried has been written in more languages than the ancient poet who originally owned it could have anticipated being translated into, and the specific sound that Dan Castellaneta produced when he saw the words annoyed grunt in a script, the sound that began as something longer and slower before being shortened to a quick, sharp syllable, has been entered into the dictionary of the English language as a genuine word used by genuine people in genuine conversations to describe a feeling that apparently required its own term to be properly named. All of that came from the lobby. All of it was improvised. All of it was protecting something else. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A character sketched in 15 minutes in a waiting room became the most recognizable face in American television comedy. Next comes the 3 years he spent on the Tracey Ullman Show before anyone knew his name, and what those early shorts reveal about who Homer Simpson was before he became who Homer Simpson is. Section 2. 48 shorts and a character still becoming. The Tracey Ullman Show ran on Fox from April of 1987 through May of 1990, and across those 3 seasons it produced 48 animated segments featuring the Simpson family. Segments that ranged in length from about 60 seconds to just under 3 minutes, and that appeared between live-action sketches as a kind of palate cleanser, something drawn and absurd to separate the human comedy from itself. The show itself was not a major ratings success, never finding the audience its producers had hoped for, but it produced the thing it will be remembered for, which is the 3-year period during which Homer Simpson and his family were slowly developed into something that could sustain a full series. The Homer of those early shorts was a specific version of the character that longtime fans who have gone back to study the archival material tend to describe with the same cluster of adjectives. He was cruder, he was louder, he was more openly threatening in his relationship to his own children, reaching for Bart's neck in a strangling gesture that that would become a recurring visual gag, but that in the shorts carried a slightly different charge, less clearly comedic and more genuinely aggressive, a physical expression of the rage that Groening had described as the character's organizing emotional principle. The warmth that would eventually define classic Homer was present only intermittently, glimpsed in occasional moments where the character's love for his family surfaced through the louder and more insistent qualities that surrounded it, like heat felt through the walls of a building where something is burning. Castellaneta was finding the voice during this period in a way that the finished series would not fully display, because by the time the series premiered, the searching had largely been completed, and what audiences heard from the first episode onward was a voice that already knew what it was. In the shorts, the voice was pitched slightly higher and had a quality of generic cartoon exasperation that made it funny in the context of each individual segment, without yet carrying the specific accumulated weight of a fully realized personality. The gradual lowering and settling of the voice across the shorts period, moving toward the register that would become iconic, is audible to anyone who listens carefully to the progression from the earliest segments to the latest ones, a performance finding its specific gravity through repetition and adjustment. The writing of the shorts was done under the supervision of James L. Brooks and Sam Simon, the experienced television producer who had been brought in to help Groening develop the concept for a full series. Simon's influence on what The Simpsons would become is a subject that the show's history has addressed imperfectly and sometimes contentiously, partly because Simon and Groening had a falling out that was serious enough to be reported publicly and that left Simon's contribution to the show's development in a complicated position within the official narrative the show has told about itself over the years. What is generally agreed is that Simon brought a level of television craft and structural sophistication to the project that Groening, who came from print cartooning rather than from television writing, did not initially have, and that the specific shape of the full series as a piece of television comedy, as opposed to as a set of visual ideas about a dysfunctional family, owes a significant debt to Simon's understanding of how half-hour comedy worked. The 48 shorts exist now as a specific category of Simpsons material that the series has only partially integrated into its own sense of its history. Some of the characters and situations established in the shorts were carried forward into the full series. Others were dropped or significantly modified. The specific tone of the shorts, their roughness, and their occasional genuine edge was softened in the transition to the series format, partly because the demands of sustaining a weekly half-hour comedy for an indeterminate number of seasons required the characters to be somewhat more consistent and somewhat more likable than a series of 60-second bursts required them to be. A character who is genuinely threatening in a 60-second segment is funny because the segment ends before the threat can fully develop into anything. A character who is genuinely threatening across 22 minutes of weekly television that audiences are expected to invite into their living rooms regularly raises different questions about likability and about the specific relationship between comedy and sympathy. The shift in Homer's characterization between the shorts and the early seasons of the full series is the clearest evidence of this softening. The full series premiere, which aired on December 17, 1989, as a Christmas special titled Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, introduced Homer to a national television audience in a story built around his attempt to provide his family with a Christmas that his income, after Marge's sisters inform on the existence of Bart's secret tattoo, and she must spend the holiday bonus removing it, cannot support. He works as a department store Santa in a dog costume, races the dog at a track, and brings the dog home when the race is lost. The story is not a story about a man whose defining quality is rage. It is a story about a man whose defining quality is the gap between what he wants to provide and what he is actually capable of providing. A gap he fills with impulsiveness and luck and an emotional investment in his family's happiness that consistently outpaces his practical ability to secure that happiness. That Homer, the Homer of Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, is recognizably continuous with the character the series would spend its best years developing, rather than with the character who had appeared in the shorts. Something changed in the transition from one format to the other, and the most convincing explanation for what changed is that the writers discovered, in the process process of building the full series that the specific comic potential of the character was larger and richer when organized around incompetence and love than when organized around rage and frustration. Both of those formulations are true of the same man. They describe the same set of qualities from different angles, but they are not equally generative as the organizing principle of a sustained narrative comedy, and the people building the show made the right choice about which one to emphasize. The physical design of Homer that appeared in the first season of the full series was already more refined than the lobby sketches, already recognizably the Homer that anyone who has seen a single episode of the show carries in their memory, though the specific visual style of the early series was rougher than what it would become across subsequent seasons as the animation budget grew and the production process became more sophisticated. The yellow skin, which Groening has said was chosen by the animation department specifically to make the characters immediately distinguishable from any other cartoon family and to ensure that channel surfing viewers would register the show as visually distinctive even from a quick glance, was present from the first episode. The 5 o'clock shadow rendered as a faint blue smear across the lower half of the face was present. The 5 remaining hairs arranged across the top of the head were present. The specific shape of the nose, and the specific blankness of the eyes, and the specific roundness of the overall figure were present. The character was designed to be recognizable in silhouette, a principle Groening has cited explicitly in discussing the family's visual design, and the silhouette test is one that Homer passes immediately and permanently. No one has ever needed to think about which yellow cartoon father is which. The voice had settled enough by the full series premiere to sound like the voice rather than like a voice in the process of becoming the voice. Castellaneta had made a series of specific choices about how the character should sound that are most clearly articulated through the story of Doe, which is the most documented of those choices simply because it became the most famous. The scripts for the Tracey Ullman shorts had included stage directions calling for an annoyed grunt at specific moments when Homer injured himself or realized he had done something foolish. Castellaneta had to decide what an annoyed grunt sounded like when produced by this specific character, and the first version of the sound he produced was longer and more drawn out than what it eventually became, something closer to a theatrical expression of frustration than the sharp, percussive syllable that ended up in the dictionary. The inspiration Castellaneta has cited for the sound was a Scottish actor named Jimmy Finlayson, who had appeared in 33 Laurel and Hardy films between 1927 and 1940, and who had developed a specific verbal mannerism as a substitute for stronger language, a drawn-out sound that functioned as a minced oath, a way of expressing the emotional content of profanity without the actual word. Castellaneta heard something in that mannerism that belonged to Homer and rendered it in the voice he was building, producing a longer version that Groening then suggested shortening on the grounds that animation's relationship to timing rewarded the quicker, more percussive sound over the drawn-out one. Castellaneta shortened it. The specific syllable was arrived at through that shortening, and its first intentional appearance in the full series was in the premiere episode, where it began accumulating the specific weight of repetition that would eventually make it a word rather than simply a sound. The word entered the New Oxford Dictionary of English in 1998, 9 years after the series premiered, defined as an exclamation used to comment on a foolish or stupid action, especially one's own. This is a remarkably precise definition for a sound that originated as a stage direction calling for an annoyed grunt in a 60-second cartoon segment about a family drawn in 15 minutes in a lobby. The path from annoyed grunt to dictionary entry passed through Castellaneta's interpretation, through Finlayson's films, through Groening's timing instinct, and through the accumulated cultural saturation of a show that was watched by enough people for long enough that a sound one character made became part of the shared vocabulary of a language. Doe is now used by people who have never watched the show and who would not identify it as a Simpsons reference, which is the specific mark of a phrase having crossed from pop culture into language, the point at which the origin becomes irrelevant to the use. The Tracey Ullman period ended in May of 1990, when the show completed its third season and was canceled. By that point, the full Simpsons series had already premiered and established itself as something the network and the country were paying attention to, in a way that the variety show hosting it had never managed to be. The shorts were the proving ground, the 3-year period in which the characters were tested against actual audiences in actual broadcast conditions, and the evidence they generated was sufficient for Fox to commission a full half-hour series. Homer Simpson crossed from the shorts to the series carrying the accumulated development of 48 test cases, a character who had been revised and adjusted through the practical feedback of being watched, who arrived at the series premiere already having been thought about more carefully than most characters in American animation had been thought about before their first episode. What the shorts gave Homer, that the series then built on, was the specific quality of being drawn from somewhere recognizable without being drawn from anywhere specific. He was not a caricature of a type. He was not a satire of a demographic. He was not an exaggeration of a familiar figure designed to make the audience feel superior to what they were watching. He was something closer to a portrait of a feeling, the feeling of being a person whose capacities and whose circumstances have not aligned in the way they were supposed to, who loves the people around him more than his behavior consistently demonstrates, and who faces each new day with a combination of appetite and incompetence that produces both comedy and, in the right hands, something that sits uncomfortably close to genuine pathos. That combination was not fully visible in the shorts, where the rage was louder than the love, and the incompetence was more physical than emotional. But the seeds of it were there, planted in the lobby and watered across 48 brief appearances on a show that nobody much watched, before they were given room to grow into something that everybody did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 48 shorts and 3 years of development delivered a character to the full series who was already more than the sum of his parts. Next comes what made him that way, the father who raised him alone and the mother who disappeared, and the specific losses that shaped the man before any audience ever met him. Section 3. The father who lied and the mother who left. Before Homer Simpson was a husband or a father or a nuclear safety inspector or a cultural institution, he was a child growing up without his mother in a house run by a man who did not particularly know how to raise him. The backstory the show eventually built for Homer, across decades of flashback episodes and occasional direct confrontations with his own past, is one of the more fully developed origin stories in the history of American sitcom, assembled gradually rather than delivered in a single explanatory episode, arriving in pieces that collectively produce a portrait of damage that the comedy running on top of it never fully obscures. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, is one of television's great comic figures in his own right, a man whose defining qualities are a specific combination of irrelevance and indignation, someone who has been left behind by time and who responds to that abandonment with the furious conviction that the world is wrong, rather than that he has been left. He lives in the Springfield Retirement Castle, a facility Homer placed him in at some point in the show's established history without the event ever being dramatized fully on screen, and he spends his days telling long, rambling stories that no one listens to about experiences that may or may not have happened. He is a World War II veteran whose military service is the cornerstone of an identity that the post-war world has made increasingly irrelevant, a man who was once part of something historically significant and who has been living off the credibility of that significance for decades without producing anything of comparable weight since. His relationship to Homer is one of the show's most carefully constructed emotional threads, a father-son dynamic built on mutual disappointment that the comedy keeps from becoming purely sad by never letting either character achieve the kind of sustained self-awareness that would make the disappointment fully articulate. Abe is proud of Homer in ways he cannot express. Homer loves Abe in ways he finds deeply inconvenient. The specific tenderness that occasionally breaks through the surface of their relationship in the show's better episodes is more affecting for being surrounded by so much irritation and misunderstanding, a warmth that exists not despite the dysfunction, but somehow because of it. The way heat generated by friction is still genuinely warm, even though its origin is collision. What Abe did to Homer, the specific act that shaped Homer's childhood more than anything else Abe was responsible for was a lie. When Homer was still a small child, his mother Mona was forced to flee the family under circumstances that will be addressed fully in a moment, and Abe, rather than explain the truth to his young son, told him that his mother had died. Homer grew up believing his mother was dead. He carried a grief for a loss that had not occurred, a missing that was real, but whose object was not gone in the way he had been told it was gone. And the specific shape that grief takes when its object is actually still alive somewhere is a complicated one that the episode Mother Simpson from the 7th season examined with more emotional precision than anyone who had not watched that episode would expect a cartoon about a yellow family in a fictional American town to be capable of. The episode begins as a comedy about Homer faking his own death to get out of work, a premise entirely consistent with the character and requiring no backstory to set up. He fakes his death, his name appears in the obituary section, and Mona Simpson sees the notice and goes to the cemetery to pay her respects to the son she thought was dead. Homer, hiding in his own grave after a series of accidents involving the open coffin, hears her voice and climbs out, and the two people who each believed the other was gone stand in a cemetery looking at each other for the first time in decades. The episode moves from that comedy setup into something genuinely, unexpectedly devastating, building the context of Mona's disappearance through flashback, and then letting the reunion between Homer and his mother carry the weight of everything it took to get there. The context established by that episode and refined through subsequent appearances is specific enough to be worth understanding in detail, because it reveals something important about the specific kind of man Homer became and about the specific losses that made him that way. Mona Simpson, in the 1960s, was a housewife married to Abe, raising Homer in a suburban household that was conventional enough on its surface and constrained enough underneath that her political awakening, when it came, arrived with the force of something that had been building for a long time in a space with no outlet. She became involved in the countercultural movement, drawn in by the idealism of the era, in a way that the show represents as genuinely felt rather than simply fashionable. A woman who actually believed in what she was doing rather than simply adopting the aesthetics of a generation. Her activism led her, along with a group of fellow protesters, into a laboratory owned by Mr. Burns, where biological warfare experiments were being conducted, and the group destroyed the experiments. As the others escaped, Mona stopped to help Burns, who had been knocked down in the chaos, and Burns, recovering, saw her face clearly enough to identify her. She became a fugitive, wanted by law enforcement, and was forced to leave her family permanently rather than face prosecution. She went to Homer's bedside while he slept, said goodbye to him without waking him, and disappeared into the underground of the counterculture, moving from commune to commune, identity to identity, living a life that was entirely different from the one she had expected to live when she married Abe and had a son in the 1950s. Abe, furious at her departure and unwilling to explain to a small child that his mother was a wanted fugitive rather than a devoted housewife, chose the simpler and crueler option. He told Homer she was dead. He invented a story, maintained it for decades, and raised his son under a lie that Homer had no reason to question and every reason to carry as a genuine grief. The specific weight of growing up believing your mother died when you were a child is a weight that shapes a person in ways that are difficult to fully articulate and impossible to fully undo. And the show, in its better moments, understood that this weight was present underneath Homer's cheerfulness and his appetites and his impulsiveness, a hole that had been formed early and that nothing he did as an adult could entirely fill. The episode Mother Simpson ends with a scene that has been cited repeatedly over the years as one of the most emotionally effective pieces of television the show ever produced. A scene that requires almost nothing from the audience except the willingness to let a cartoon be genuinely sad for a moment. After Mona is recognized by Burns and forced to flee again, driving away in a car as Homer watches from the road, the episode cuts to Homer sitting on the hood of his own car in the dark, alone, looking up at the stars. There is no joke. There is no resolution. There is no character moment designed to restore the comic equilibrium before the credits roll. There is just a man on the hood of his car at night, watching the direction his mother went, and the credits roll over that image in silence, rather than over the usual end title music. The silence was apparently a decision made against the instincts of some of the people involved in the production, who felt that comedy required a return to stability before an episode could conclude. The decision to hold the silence was the right one. It is one of the moments in the show's history that demonstrates most clearly what Homer Simpson was capable of being when the writers were willing to trust the character's depth rather than retreating to the safety of comedy before the feeling had fully registered. Mona appeared in the series 3 more times after that first major episode, each appearance adding complexity to her relationship with Homer without fully resolving it, because the specific relationship between a person and the parent who abandoned them is not a relationship that resolves cleanly, regardless of how much goodwill exists on both sides. She was voiced primarily by Glenn Close across her major appearances, a casting choice that brought a level of acting craft to the role that few animated supporting characters receive, and Close's performance in the Mother Simpson episode in particular carries the specific quality of someone playing genuine regret rather than the performance of genuine regret, which is a distinction that animation voice acting rarely has to navigate, and that Close navigated with unusual precision. Mona died in the 19th season episode titled Mona Leavesa, a title that plays on the character's history of departures with a lightness that the episode itself does not fully sustain, because the death of a parent, even a parent who has been absent for most of a child's life, is not a subject that comedy can entirely absorb. Homer had to let her go in a specific, final sense in that episode, and the show handled the conclusion with the care it had brought to the character from her first major appearance, understanding that the loss of Mona meant something to Homer that went beyond the ordinary grief of losing an elderly relative, because what Homer was losing was not only his mother, but the ongoing possibility of a relationship that had never been fully realized. The specific damage that Abe's lie and Mona's departure did to Homer is not something the show ever articulates directly, because direct articulation is not the register the show works in, and because Homer himself is not a character given to direct articulation of his own psychology. What the show does instead is build the damage into the patterns of his behavior in ways that become legible if watched with enough attention across enough episodes. His tendency toward impulsive action, toward launching himself head first into whatever the current moment seems to require without pausing to consider consequences, reflects someone who learned early that circumstances can change completely and without warning, that stability is not something that can be counted on, and that the appropriate response to the present moment is therefore to inhabit it as fully as possible, rather than to plan for a future that may not arrive in any form resembling what was planned. His hunger for food and for experience and for approval and for belonging reflects someone for whom the ordinary satisfactions of a childhood were disrupted early enough that the appetite for them never fully matured into the more measured adult relationship to satisfaction that a less interrupted childhood might have produced. He eats the way someone eats who is not entirely sure the food will still be there if they slow down. He pursues experiences with the energy of someone who has internalized, at a level below conscious understanding, the knowledge that things end without notice, and his love for his own children, the specific ferocity of it, the way it can break through his selfishness and his laziness and his spectacular incompetence as a parent to produce moments of genuine, undisguised devotion, reflects someone who understands what it costs a child to grow up without being loved, and who is determined, in whatever imperfect and inconsistent way his character allows, not to be the cause of that cost for the children he was given. He fails at this regularly. He succeeds at it sometimes when it matters most. The specific ratio of those two outcomes is the show's central emotional subject, and it is a subject that only has the weight it has because of Abe's lie and Mona's departure, and the specific shape of the hole those two events left in the man Homer Simpson became. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The damage done in Homer's childhood became the emotional architecture underneath everything the show would build on top of it. Next comes the woman who chose him anyway, the specific story of how Homer Simpson and Marge Bouvier found each other and what their relationship actually says about both of them. Section 4. The Girl He Never Should Have Met. The story of how Homer Simpson and Marge Bouvier found each other character is told across several different episodes of the series, assembled from flashbacks that are not always entirely consistent with each other in their specific details, but that together produce a picture coherent enough in its emotional shape that the inconsistencies feel less like errors and more like the natural imprecision of memory. The way the same story told by two people who lived it together will always differ slightly in the details while agreeing on the thing that mattered. The most complete version of the story is told in the Season 2 episode The Way We Was, which aired in January of 1991 and remains one of the most quietly affecting episodes the show produced in its early years. An episode that works not because it is particularly funny, though it has its funny moments, but because it takes the question of why these two specific people ended up together seriously enough to produce an answer that feels earned rather than assumed. Most romantic comedies, animated or otherwise, treat the union of their central couple as the destination of the story, rather than as a question the story is genuinely trying to answer. The Way We Was treats it as a genuine question and provides a genuine answer, which is that Homer and Marge ended up together not because they were obviously suited to each other, but because he loved her with a consistency and a specificity that, over time, overcame every obstacle his own behavior created. The setting is Springfield High School in 1974. Homer and Marge are both teenagers, both juniors, attending the same school without having met in any meaningful way. Their social orbits sufficiently different that proximity has not produced connection. Homer is already, at 17, recognizably himself in most of the ways that matter. He is not academically inclined. He is not particularly popular. He is not working toward anything with any visible plan. He has the same appetite and the same impulsiveness and the same quality of genuine warmth buried under genuinely poor judgment that the adult version carries, all of it untempered by the experience of consequence that the subsequent decades will provide without fundamentally changing the underlying character. Marge at 17 is already recognizably herself as well, which means she is already considerably more thoughtful and more ambitious and more organized than Homer, already possessed of the specific combination of sweetness and stubbornness that would define her as an adult, already someone who has opinions about things and the willingness to express them clearly. She is also, in the high school context, slightly outside the social mainstream in a way that the show attributes to her hair, the large blue beehive that she maintains with the same commitment across her entire life, regardless of what anyone says about it. A hairstyle that her mother wears in a slightly different form and that became one of the show's most distinctive visual signatures, inspired by graining, partly by the Bride of Frankenstein's iconic vertical styling, and partly by his own mother's hair during the 1960s. The specific mechanism through which Homer and Marge meet in the episode is a French class detention. Homer is there because he was caught smoking in the boys' bathroom, a transgression that the show depicts with the mild, period-appropriate seriousness that such things carried in the 1970s, before the specific social dynamics around teenage smoking shifted enough to make the scene feel like documentary. Marge is there because she was caught burning her brassiere as an act of feminist protest, a detail that establishes her political sensibility at 17, and that also places her in the same room as Homer in a way that would not have occurred under any other set of circumstances, because their social trajectories had no natural intersection point. Homer falls for her immediately. The episode is unambiguous about this, which is one of the qualities that makes it more emotionally honest than most romantic narratives built around the slow development of feeling. There is no slow development. Homer sees Marge, and something in him that the show has established as genuine and not easily dismissed responds to her in a way that produces commitment rather than simply interest. He pursues her across the episode with the specific mixture of sincerity and incompetence that defines him as a person, arriving swiping at each attempt at connection with the full force of his feeling and less than half of the practical skills required to execute it effectively. His primary strategy is to convince her to tutor him in French, manufacturing the pretense of academic need in order to spend time with her. This is dishonest in a mild and transparent way, and the episode does not obscure its dishonesty. Homer is lying to get close to Marge, a beginning that the story acknowledges rather than glossing over, because the story is interested in the truth of how this relationship started rather than in the romance of a cleaned-up version. The tutoring sessions produce exactly what Homer hoped they would produce, which is time together that allows Marge to see something in him that was not visible from the distance of their separate social orbits, something that she describes in the episode as a spark, a quality of genuine life and genuine feeling that exists underneath the surface incompetence. The story's turning point, the moment the episode has been building toward with the patience of something that knows it has something worth waiting for, involves the prom. Homer asks Marge. She accepts. He prepares for the evening with the particular seriousness he reserves for things that matter to him in a way he cannot fully articulate, which is to say, with enthusiasm rather than with competence. And then the evening goes wrong in the specific way that evenings built around Homer's good intentions tend to go wrong, which is that his good intentions run into his bad judgment, and the two of them produce consequences he did not foresee and cannot easily repair. He shows up to take her to prom in a car he has borrowed from Barney Gumble, his childhood friend and the person most responsible for introducing Homer to beer, which Castellaneta has said in interviews was done during their teenage years when Homer talked Barney into trying alcohol and inadvertently derailed a promising academic trajectory that had been pointing toward Harvard before the beer arrived. The car breaks down. Alternative arrangements are made, but they are not the arrangements Marge had been expecting. She spends prom with Artie Ziff instead, a classmate who is articulate and presentable, and who is interested in her in a way that is immediately and specifically less genuine than Homer's interest, organized around his own ego and his own desires, rather than around any real attention to who she actually is. Artie Ziff is voiced in his appearances in the series by John Lovitz, a casting choice that carries its own specific humor, since Lovitz built a career partly on playing characters whose self-presentation exceeded their actual substance, and the character of Artie Ziff is exactly that, a man who appears to have more to offer than Homer while actually having considerably less, whose sophistication is performance rather than character, whose attention to Marge is about what she represents to him rather than who she is to him. Homer's interest, operating below the level of sophistication entirely, is about exactly who she is, which is a less immediately impressive quality and a more durable one. The episode ends with a scene in which Homer and Marge are in a car together after the prom, having found each other again in the parking lot after Marge's evening with Artie has ended badly enough for her to want to be somewhere else. Homer admits that he is not good at French and never was, that the tutoring sessions were a pretense, that everything he told her to arrange the time together was constructed from his desire to be near her rather than from any genuine academic need. This is a confession of manipulation, delivered in the specific register of someone who is genuinely not entirely sure whether what he did was wrong, because his intentions were so completely unmixed with any self-interest beyond the desire to be with her that the dishonesty of the mechanism by which he arranged it does not register to him as fully dishonest. Marge does not immediately forgive him for it. The episode ends with the two of them parting without resolution, which is unusual for a romantic comedy and unusual for this show in particular, which often restored its equilibrium before the final credits. The resolution is provided by the framing device wrapped around the main story, which is Homer and Marge in the present day of the series, sitting together watching television, their marriage established and their children asleep, which is the resolution the episode has been building toward without ever showing it, because the audience already knows that the two people in the high school flashback end up together, and the episode is therefore free to let the high school story be complicated and unresolved. The knowledge that it works out doing the emotional work that a conventional ending would do with a scene. What the episode ultimately establishes about Homer and Marge is something that the show would return to across its best seasons whenever it wanted to say something true about why their marriage worked, rather than simply assuming that it did. The reason is not that they they are obviously suited to each other, because they are not in any obvious way. Marge is more disciplined than Homer, more organized, more patient, more capable of sustained commitment to a course of action that does not immediately gratify. Homer is more impulsive, more self-indulgent, more likely to pursue whatever the current moment is offering without considering the next moment at all. These are not qualities that naturally complement each other. They are qualities that naturally collide, and the show's marriage plots, in the seasons when it handled them well, were built on the specific productive tension of that collision rather than on any fantasy of easy compatibility. The reason it works, according to the show at its best, is the spark Marge mentioned in the high school story and what the spark grew into over the years of their marriage. Homer sees Marge with a consistency and a specificity that his limitations never fully interrupted, a quality of attention that survived his selfishness and his impulsiveness and his spectacular capacity for doing the wrong thing at the wrong moment. He knows who she is. He chooses her knowing who she is, and she, having recognized what was underneath the bad judgment and the poor execution, chose him back with the same quality of informed decision that he brought to his pursuit of her, which is one of the few areas where Homer Simpson has ever demonstrated anything close to wisdom. Their marriage survived decades of television storytelling that tested it regularly and severely, because the show understood that a relationship between two people this different from each other is genuinely interesting to watch under stress, in a way that a relationship between two people who are obviously suited to each other is not. The stress always revealed the same thing underneath it, which was that they had chosen each other knowing what they were choosing, and that choice was real in a way that the comedy running over the top of it never fully obscured. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Homer's pursuit of Marge established the most important thing about his character, that his love, when directed at something real, operates with a consistency his intelligence and his judgment never quite managed to achieve. Next comes where he ended up working, why a nuclear power plant was the perfect location for him, and what the specific job he holds there says about who he is. Section 5, Sector 7G. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not a realistic nuclear power plant. This is worth stating plainly, because the show has occasionally gestured toward realism in its depiction of the facility, using the nuclear power plant setting as the backdrop for episodes that touch on genuine concerns about industrial safety and corporate negligence, and the specific relationship between a company town's economy and its tolerance for the dangers produced by its primary employer. But the plant as it actually functions within the show is a comic exaggeration of the kind of industrial workplace that exists in the American imagination, rather than a documentary representation of any actual facility. And its comic exaggeration is organized around a single, perfectly chosen irony that sits at the center of Homer Simpson's professional life, and that the show never stopped finding generative across 35 years of episodes. Homer Simpson is a nuclear safety inspector. He is unqualified for this job. He neglects the duties it requires. He sleeps at his workstation. He has caused multiple near disasters and at least several actual disasters in his decades of employment at the facility, and he continues to hold the position through a combination of his employer's spectacular indifference to the competence of his workforce, the specific regulatory environment governing the nuclear industry in the fictional Springfield of the show, and the kind of institutional inertia that allows genuinely dangerous situations to persist in large organizations for much longer than they should, simply because no one has been assigned the specific task of fixing them. Matt Groening has said in interviews that he chose the nuclear power plant as Homer's workplace specifically for the comedy generated by the gap between the stakes of the job and the character doing it. There is nothing in American industrial life with higher stakes than nuclear safety. The consequences of failure in that specific context are not limited to the person who failed or to the company that employed them. They extend to the surrounding community, to the groundwater, to the food supply, to the atmosphere, across geographical and generational distances that make nuclear contamination categorically different in scale from most other forms of industrial failure. Putting a man who falls asleep on the job, who treats safety protocols as suggestions rather than requirements, who has demonstrated across hundreds of episodes that his attention is reliably captured by anything more interesting than the actual work he is being being paid to do, in charge of monitoring the safety of this specific kind of facility, was a comic choice of almost mathematical perfection. The gap between the stakes and the person responsible for managing them is as wide as it can possibly be made, which is the exact condition that produces the best situational comedy. Homer's specific assignment within the plant is to Sector 7G, the control room where safety monitoring is conducted, and his specific job title is Safety Inspector, a designation that the show treats with consistent irony throughout its run. He is not a safety inspector in any meaningful operational sense. He is a man who sits in a chair in a room full of monitoring equipment, performing a function that the equipment could largely perform without him if the equipment were properly maintained, and if anyone whose salary depended on its maintenance had the kind of investment in the facility's actual operational integrity that Mr. Burns, the plant's owner, demonstrably does not have. Mr. Burns, Charles Montgomery Burns, is one of the great comic villains in the history of American television, a figure so comprehensively removed from any normal human experience of consequences that his villainy is not threatening in the way that a realistic villain's villainy would be threatening, but rather comic in the specific way that complete impunity is always comic when observed from a sufficient distance. He is extremely old, the show's inconsistencies about his exact age aside, old enough that his references and his assumptions belong to a historical period that the other characters do not share, and his wealth is extreme enough that the normal mechanisms by which society corrects the behavior of people who harm it have never successfully applied to him. He does not know Homer's name. He has been informed of Homer's name on many occasions and has failed to retain it on all of them. Homer has existed in Mr. Burns's orbit for decades without registering on Burns's consciousness in any durable way, which is itself a comic condition that the show milked carefully and precisely rather than wearing out through overuse. The relationship between Homer and Mr. Burns is not a relationship in any conventional sense. It is more accurately described as Homer's proximity to a force that occasionally notices his existence without being able to sustain that notice, and Burns's periodic awareness of Homer that never quite accumulates into genuine recognition. In the episodes that used this dynamic most effectively, the comedy came from Burns's specific failure to understand Homer as a person, despite having had extended and significant interactions with him, a failure that the show read not as cruelty exactly, but as the specific kind of obliviousness that belongs to someone whose experience of other people has always been mediated by the distance that extreme wealth creates between the very rich and everyone else. Homer's relationship to the job itself has a specific quality that distinguishes it from simple laziness, though laziness is certainly present. He is not someone who refuses to do his job out of any principled rejection of the work. He is someone for whom the work is genuinely not engaging enough to hold his attention against the competing claims of hunger and distraction and the specific gravity of sleep, which exerts a stronger pull on Homer than on most cartoon characters and most human beings. He falls asleep at his workstation with a frequency that the show treats as a running condition rather than a single recurring joke, and the specific image of Homer slumped in his chair in Sector 7G with various indicator lights on the control panel flashing unattended behind him is one of the show's most durable visual metaphors for the gap between what is supposed to be happening in American institutional life and what is actually happening. The decision to place Homer in this specific job reflects something about the show's broader satirical project that is worth understanding clearly, because The Simpsons, during its best years, was not satire in the simple sense of exaggerating real things for comic effect. It was satire in the more precise sense of identifying the structural conditions that allow genuinely dangerous things to exist without consequence, and dramatizing those conditions through characters who are funny rather than frightening, so that the comedy can carry the observation without making it feel like a lecture. Homer in Sector 7G is not just a lazy man in the wrong job. He is the embodiment of a regulatory and corporate failure mode that the show understood to be real, the mode in which an industry with catastrophic potential for harm is supervised by people who have no meaningful incentive to do the supervision well, who are employed by a company whose owner has no meaningful incentive to employ supervisors well, and who are regulated by a government whose relationship to the industry is close enough to compromise the independence of the regulation. This is a serious mysterious observation dressed in the clothing of a joke about a man who falls asleep at work, and the show's ability to make the observation without the joke becoming a lecture was one of the defining qualities of its best seasons, a quality that required the comedy to be genuinely funny rather than merely illustrative, so that the observation could travel inside the comedy rather than requiring a separate delivery mechanism. Homer has held, across the full run of the series, more than 180 different jobs in addition to his primary position at the plant, a figure that the show's own internal materials have documented and that reflects the specific episodic structure of a narrative comedy that needs each episode to be self-contained enough to work without requiring the audience to have seen every previous episode, while still maintaining enough consistency that the character relationships remain continuous. The side jobs and temporary careers that Homer embarks on in individual episodes are not continuity errors or failures of character consistency. They are expressions of a specific quality in Homer that is actually one of his most sympathetically drawn characteristics, which is an openness to possibility and an appetite for new experience that his judgment is not equipped to channel productively, but that his enthusiasm drives him toward repeatedly, regardless of the outcome of the previous attempt. He has been a food critic, a country music manager, a monorail conductor, a barbershop singer, a boxer, a missionary, a carnival worker, a mafia associate, a snowplow operator, an astronaut, a power plant union organizer, a personal shopper, a feng shui consultant, a bodyguard, a bear patrol officer, and many dozens of other things, each for approximately one episode before the situation resolves and he returns to the nuclear power plant. The astronaut episode, Deep Space Homer, from Season 5, is among the most celebrated of the single-episode job premises, sending Homer into actual space as part of a NASA effort to make the space program relatable to ordinary Americans after years of declining public interest. And the episode uses the premise to produce one of the show's most precisely constructed satires of the gap between institutional presentation and institutional reality. The comedy of Homer in space works because the gap between who he is and where he is at its maximum there, as far from Sector 7G as the episode's premise can take him, while still returning him to it by the time the credits roll. The nuclear power plant has served the show not only as Homer's workplace, but as one of Springfield's most significant pieces of architecture, a presence in the town's economy and environment that shapes the show's world in ways that go beyond the specific episodes set within it. The plant employs a significant portion of Springfield's working population. Its smokestacks are visible on the Springfield skyline in exterior shots throughout the series. Its waste products flow into the river that runs through the town in ways the show has depicted with consistent environmental irony, the three-eyed fish Blinky being the most durable of the plant's ecological contributions to Springfield's natural history, a mutant fish that appeared in a Season 2 episode as evidence of the plant's impact on local wildlife, and that has become one of the show's recurring visual symbols of the specific kind of environmental damage that prosperous industries inflict on the communities that host them. The three-eyed fish appeared in an episode called Two Cars in Every Garage and Three Eyes on Every Fish, in which Mr. Burns attempts to deal with a government investigation of the plant's environmental record by running for governor of Springfield rather than addressing the actual problems the investigation identified, a plot that the show handles with the specific comic fury that its best political episodes brought to the observation that the most effective response to institutional accountability is often to gain control of the institution doing the accounting. Burns loses the election, undone by Marge's refusal to serve him the three-eyed fish at a carefully staged dinner designed to demonstrate the fish's palatability, a small act of resistance that the episode treats as both genuinely significant and entirely insufficient, because the plant continues to operate and the fish continues to have three eyes, regardless of Burns losing a single election. Homer's relationship to the plant and to his job within it has a specific emotional quality that the show has occasionally allowed to surface in ways that complicate the simple comedy of the lazy, incompetent worker. There are episodes in which Homer's genuine investment in his work, beneath the sleeping and the distraction passion and the impulsiveness becomes visible in moments where the stakes are high enough to cut through everything else. He loves his family, and the job is what allows him to support his family, which means that whatever he thinks of the job in any given moment, his relationship to it is not simply one of indifference, but of something more complicated, an ambivalence organized around the specific tension between wanting to do something meaningful and needing to do something that pays. That tension is not unique to Homer. It is one of the most common features of working life in any economy that asks a significant portion of its population to do work that is not intrinsically rewarding in exchange for the means to support the things outside of work that are intrinsically rewarding. Homer embodies that tension without analyzing it, which is part of what makes him recognizable as a specific kind of American worker rather than simply as a cartoon incompetent. He is not failing at his job because he does not understand what the job requires. He is failing at his job because the job is not interesting enough to hold his attention against everything else that competes for it, and the structural response to that situation, which would require addressing either the quality of the job or the conditions under which it is performed, is not something that the institution employing him has any interest in undertaking. The plant will keep running. Homer will keep sleeping. The indicator lights will keep flashing unattended in Sector 7G, and Springfield will keep drinking the water downstream from the facility where all of this is happening, three-eyed fish swimming in it, because the gap between the stakes of the situation and the attention being paid to those stakes is precisely the gap that the show was always interested in, and that gap has never fully closed in either the fiction or the reality the fiction is describing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The nuclear power plant gave Homer the perfect professional home, a place where the stakes of his incompetence were as high as they could be, and the consequences of that incompetence were as thoroughly insulated from him as a company could arrange. Next comes the era when everything the show had been building around him reached its peak, the golden age that Homer carried and that defined what television comedy could do with a character this specific. Section 6. The Golden Age. The phrase Golden Age gets applied to the histories of enough things that it has lost some of its precision, becoming a general term for any period in a long-running enterprise that later generations look back on with particular affection. In the case of The Simpsons, it retains its precision because the specific period the phrase refers to is bounded clearly enough and qualitatively distinct enough from what surrounds it that the designation is not simply nostalgia doing interpretive work on ordinary material. The golden age of The Simpsons is roughly seasons 3 through 8, airing from 1991 through 1997, and within that period, Homer Simpson was transformed from a well-designed supporting character in a family ensemble into something that American television had not previously produced, a comedic protagonist of genuine complexity whose stupidity and selfishness and impulsiveness were not the totality of his character, but the surface through which a more complicated and more affecting interior could be glimpsed. The shift from Bart to Homer as the show's primary focus happened gradually rather than through any announced decision, but it was complete enough by the 4th season that the show's creative team acknowledged it explicitly. Matt Groening's explanation for why the shift occurred is one of the most illuminating things said about Homer's comic potential during the show's entire run. The argument was that with a juvenile delinquent as the protagonist, there was a natural ceiling on what situations he could be placed in and what consequences could meaningfully befall him, because the comedy of a child doing outrageous things is bounded by what children can actually do. Homer, as an adult, had no such ceiling. The consequences of his stupidity could be genuinely catastrophic. The situations his impulsiveness could create were not constrained by age or by the specific limited agency of childhood. He could launch himself headfirst into every impulsive thought that occurred to him, and the range of those thoughts, combined with his complete absence of judgment about which ones should be acted on, was essentially limitless. This is the precise creative logic that produced some of the most celebrated individual episodes in the show's entire history. Episodes built around Homer Homer pursuing a single impulse through every available consequence until the situation had been pushed as far as it would go, and something, usually Marge or fate or his own physical exhaustion, brought it back to equilibrium. Homer's Enemy from Season 8, in which a competent and genuinely qualified nuclear safety professional named Frank Grimes arrives at the plant and is driven to a nervous breakdown by the specific injustice of Homer's inexplicable comfort in a life he has done nothing to deserve, is probably the episode that most directly examined Homer's character from an external perspective, using Grimes as a surrogate for anyone who has ever looked at Homer and asked the obvious question. The episode's answer to that question is not comforting. Homer's comfort is not earned. His life is not proportionate to his contributions. The world, as The Simpsons depicts it, does not consistently reward merit, and Homer Simpson is the proof of that. A man whose fundamental goodness and fundamental uselessness are equally real, and whose life accommodates both of them simultaneously without collapsing into tragedy. The episode Marge versus the Monorail from Season 4, written by Conan O'Brien before he left the show to host Late Night, used Homer's impulsiveness as the engine of a plot about civic corruption and the specific vulnerability of small communities to charming salespeople who exploit local pride. Homer becomes the monorail conductor not through any particular qualification, but through the specific enthusiasm he brings to the idea of being a monorail conductor, an enthusiasm that the town's residents find more convincing than the reservations expressed by anyone with actual knowledge of what a monorail requires to operate safely. The episode is structured as a deliberate homage to The Music Man, the American musical comedy about a con artist who sells a town on a band it cannot afford. And the homage is precise enough that it functions as both parody and genuine extension of the source material, finding in Homer the specific figure the Music Man tradition requires. A man whose belief in what he is doing is so complete that it temporarily overrides the rational objections of the people around him. Duffless from Season 4 used the structure of a bottle episode, confining most of its action to a single setting and a limited set of characters, to examine Homer's relationship to alcohol with more honesty and more care than most American television comedies were willing to bring to that subject. Homer gives up beer for a month as the result of a bet with Marge, and the episode follows both his struggle with that commitment and the specific texture of his daily life when the thing that usually mediates his relationship to discomfort and boredom is removed. The episode is funny in the specific way that things observed very accurately are always funny, because accuracy applied to human weakness produces comedy that is embarrassing and recognizable in equal measure, and Homer's relationship to his own limitations is sufficiently unguarded that the accuracy never tips into cruelty. Bart gets an F from Season 2, which is technically before the Golden Age proper, but which demonstrates the show's capacity for genuine pathos in a context that would be expected to produce only comedy, used Homer's relationship with Bart to produce an episode that remains one of the most emotionally honest pieces of television the show ever made. Bart is threatened with being held back a grade, and Homer's investment in his son's success, clumsy and imperfectly expressed, as all of Homer's emotional investments are, becomes the engine of an episode that manages to be both genuinely funny and genuinely sad about the specific way that parental love and parental helplessness coexist without resolving each other. What united the Golden Age episodes that used Homer most effectively was the specific balance they maintained between his comedy and his character, a balance that required the writers to have a genuine understanding of both simultaneously, rather than treating the comedy as the primary purpose and the character as its vehicle. The comedy worked because the character was real. When the character was real, situations that would have been simply slapstick in the hands of a more superficially drawn protagonist became something else. Jokes that carried an emotional undertow, punchlines that landed harder because the person they were happening to was someone the audience had been given reason to understand as more than a collection of comic traits. Homer's relationship to his own intelligence during the Golden Age was handled with particular care. The show established that Homer was not simply stupid in the generic sense of the word, but was specifically limited in his executive function, his ability to plan and to consider consequences, and to delay delay gratification in favor of a better outcome later. The intelligence was present in other forms. He had genuine creative instincts. He had a specific kind of emotional intelligence, uneven and unreliable, but real, that allowed him to understand what people needed from him in moments of genuine crisis, even when he routinely failed to understand what they needed from him in ordinary moments. He had an appetite for experience and a genuine responsiveness to the world around him that people of genuinely limited intelligence do not have. What he lacked was the governor that most adults develop between the impulse to do something and the action of doing it. The fraction of a second delay in which consequence is calculated, and the impulse is either modified or abandoned. The episode Homer's Barbershop Quartet from Season 5 used the framing device of Homer discovering that he was once a successful musician, a member of a barbershop quartet called the B Sharps that achieved genuine celebrity in the late 1980s. As a vehicle for examining the specific quality of Homer's relationship to success and to the past. The episode is structured as a sustained parody of Beatles mythology, following the B Sharps through a trajectory that mirrors the Beatles' own story with enough precision that the parody functions as both comedy and genuine analysis of the specific cultural dynamics that produce and consume celebrity. Homer's role within the parody is the lovable but limited figure whose talent is real within the specific context of his group, but who would be nothing without the collective. A reading of the character that the episode deploys with more generosity than it might appear to deserve. You Only Move Twice, from Season 8, is the episode most frequently cited by the show's creative alumni and by critics as the single finest example of what the Golden Age could do with Homer's character, partly because it managed to do something genuinely unexpected with a character who had been on television for 7 seasons and who the audience believed they fully understood. Homer is recruited by a charming and hyper-competent man named Hank Scorpio to manage his nuclear division in a new town called Cypress Creek, and the episode follows Homer's experience of working for a genuinely excellent employer who values his contributions while simultaneously establishing that Scorpio is a James Bond-style supervillain attempting world domination. The comedy of the episode comes from Homer's complete obliviousness to Scorpio's villainy. So focused is he on his own professional satisfaction and on his family's adjustment to the new town. And the episode ends with Scorpio achieving his goals and rewarding Homer generously before Homer returns to Springfield and his old job, because the rest of his family was not happy in Cypress Creek. The ending is one of the most quietly melancholy in the show's Golden Age run, not because anything bad has happened to Homer exactly, but because the episode has raised the question of what Homer's professional life might have been if the circumstances had been different, if he had ended up working for someone who actually valued him, and then resolved that question by returning everything to exactly the position it was in before. The specific sadness of the episode's ending is the sadness of a counterfactual glimpsed and then closed, the life that might have been visible for 22 minutes before the structural requirements of the series format sealed it off. The writing room during the Golden Age was staffed by some of the most talented comedy writers working in American television at the time, including O'Brien before his departure, John Swartzwelder, whose episodes are among the most consistently praised individual contributions to the series, George Meyer, who has been described by colleagues as the show's most important writer during its peak years, John Vitti, Jeff Martin, David Silverman, and others who brought to the work a shared understanding that comedy at its highest level required the same kind of craft and structural intelligence that any other serious writing required. The culture of the writing room during this period has been described by multiple people who worked in it as intensely competitive and intensely collaborative simultaneously, a combination that produced the specific quality of writing that characterizes the best Golden Age episodes, jokes that arrive from unexpected angles while still being the inevitable product of the logic that set them up. Homer was the primary beneficiary of this writing culture because he was the character that offered the widest canvas for what the room could do. Every writer understood Homer in a way that allowed them to write him without losing the specific quality that made him the specific person he was. The precise combination of appetites and limitations and warmth and impulsiveness that produced someone recognizable from any angle without ever being predictable from any angle. The Golden Age produced over 100 episodes of Homer Simpson operating at the fullest expression of what the character was capable of being, and those episodes established a standard for what a television comedy protagonist could be that has influenced American comedy writing in ways that extend far beyond the show itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Golden Age produced the fullest expression of Homer Simpson's potential and established a standard for American television comedy that is still being measured against. Next comes what happened to that standard after the peak, and how the character changed when the writing room changed around him. Section 7. What happened after the peak? Every long-running creative enterprise that achieves a genuine golden age faces the same structural problem when that age ends, which is that the end is rarely announced and rarely visible in real time, arriving instead as a gradual accumulation of small departures from what made the peak period what it was. Each individual departure defensible on its own terms, and only clearly legible as part of a decline when enough of them have accumulated that the distance from the peak is too large to attribute to ordinary variation. The Simpsons was not immune to this dynamic, and Homer Simpson was not immune to what happened to the show's characters when the writing culture that had produced the Golden Age began to change. The change was not sudden. Season 9, which aired in 1997 and 1998, contains episodes that belong to the show's best work, alongside episodes that show early evidence of what would eventually become the defining failure mode of the later seasons. The distinction between those two categories of episode within a single season is itself evidence of a writing culture in transition, a room that still contained the knowledge of how to do the thing at its best, while beginning to lose the consensus about what that knowledge required. The Golden Age had depended on a specific shared understanding among the writers of what Homer was for and what the comedy around him needed to accomplish. An understanding sufficiently deep that individual writers with different sensibilities could all write the same character without producing inconsistent versions of him. When that shared understanding began to erode, the character began to fragment into versions that shared his name and his physical design without sharing the specific interior that had made him worth caring about. The pattern of change that critics and longtime viewers have most consistently identified is the one that has come to be called jerk Homer, a term that describes a specific version of the character that became increasingly dominant in the later seasons, a version in which Homer's selfishness and his impulsiveness were no longer the comic surface through which his genuine warmth and his genuine love occasionally broke through, but rather the totality of his characterization, a man whose bad behavior existed for its own sake, rather than in tension with anything else. Jerk Homer does things that genuinely harm the people around him, without the episode producing any meaningful consequence for those harms, and without the character demonstrating the specific quality of obliviousness about what he has done that had always previously redeemed the worst of his behavior in the Golden Age, the quality of genuinely not understanding that he had caused harm, rather than simply not caring. The distinction between not understanding and not caring is the precise distinction between Homer Simpson and a cruel person, and the later seasons blurred that distinction repeatedly in ways that made Homer less sympathetically drawn without making him more interestingly drawn, a downgrade that produced neither the warmth of the classic version nor the darker comic energy that a genuinely cruel protagonist might have provided if the show had committed to going in that direction. What the Jerk Homer episodes produced instead was a version of the character who was simply unpleasant in ways the comedy could not adequately frame, because the comedy was not built for a character who was genuinely unpleasant, having been built instead for a character who was genuinely limited but genuinely loving. The specific episodes that exemplify what went wrong are ones in which Homer does something harmful to Marge or to one of his children. The episode acknowledges that the harm has occurred and then moves past it without any meaningful reckoning, because the narrative logic of the later seasons had lost track of why consequence mattered to the comedy in the first place. The Golden Age episodes in which Homer harmed the people around him always contained the seeds of their own resolution, either in Homer's genuine distress at what he had had done once he understood it, or in the specific comedic logic that made the harm funny rather than simply unpleasant, or in the equilibrium restoring mechanism of the episode's structure itself. The later episodes often contained none of these things, producing harms without either comedic framing or emotional consequence, which left viewers in the uncomfortable position of having watched a character they had been given reason to care about behave in ways the show was not asking them to process as anything other than comedy that had not quite arrived. The Flanderization of Homer, a term borrowed from the fate of his neighbor Ned Flanders, whose character underwent a similar reduction across the later seasons, was not a single event, but a process, visible across individual episodes and across seasons as a gradual replacement of complexity with simplicity, a trading of a character who contained genuine contradictions for a character defined primarily by a single repeated trait. In Homer's case, the single repeated trait that survived the reduction was appetite, the specific desire for donuts and beer and television and the next pleasurable experience, stripped of the context that had made the appetite comic in the Golden Age, which was its coexistence with genuine love and genuine aspiration, and the specific vulnerability of a man who wanted more than he knew how to want. The appetite without the vulnerability is simply a cartoon character eating. The appetite in tension with the vulnerability is Homer Simpson, and what the later seasons gradually lost was the tension while retaining the appetite, producing a character who was recognizable as Homer in every visual and superficial particular while being qualitatively different from the character the Golden Age had built. Mike Reiss and Al Jean, who served as showrunners during the third and fourth seasons, and the subsequent regimes of David Merkin and then Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, each brought specific qualities and limitations to the task of running the show, but the writing rooms they assembled during the earlier years of those tenures still contained enough of the original creative culture that the character maintained something close to his Golden Age form. The later showrunning regimes, particularly from season 9 onward, under Mike Scully and then Gene in his second stint, were working with a writing staff that was increasingly constituted of people who had learned how to write Homer by watching the show, rather than by being present for the specific creative culture that produced the character's best work. And the difference between those two bases of knowledge is exactly the difference between knowing what the character does and knowing why he does it. The what of Homer Simpson is fully documented in the episodes themselves. Anyone who watches enough of them can identify his catchphrases, his behavioral patterns, his recurring situations, his physical comedy conventions, the specific things he says and does in response to specific kinds of provocation. The why of Homer Simpson is something else, something that the Golden Age writers had in a form that allowed them to generate new expressions of it that felt true to the character, and that later writers often had only in the form of the documented what, which they could reproduce without reproducing the underlying understanding that made the what mean something rather than simply being familiar. The physical comedy around Homer underwent a specific change in the later seasons that is worth noting as a separate dimension of the character's transformation. The Golden Age had used Homer's body as a comic instrument with genuine craft, finding visual jokes that were built into the character's specific physical design and that could not have been done with any differently designed body. The later seasons increasingly used Homer's body as simply a vehicle for escalating physical harm, producing injury escalations that became longer and more extreme as the seasons progressed without becoming proportionately funnier, because the comedy of physical harm depends on the specific relationship between the audience's sympathy for the person being harmed and the degree of harm being inflicted, and the jerk Homer episodes had eroded the sympathy that the harm needed to play against. There are episodes in the later seasons that produced genuine comedy and genuine character work, and acknowledging this is important for intellectual honesty about what the decline actually looked like, rather than simply treating the post-Golden Age period as a single, uniform failure. The show never became entirely bad. It became inconsistent in a way the Golden Age had not been, which is a different kind of failure, the failure of a creative enterprise that has retained enough of its original capacity to produce good work occasionally without retaining enough of its original culture to produce good work consistently. Homer in the later seasons could still be the Homer of the Golden Age when the episode demanded it, and when the writer understood what that demanded. The episodes that achieved that quality after the Golden Golden Age tend to be the ones written by the veterans of the Golden Age room, who continued to contribute to the show long after its peak, writers like Swartzwelder, whose work maintained a specific quality of structural intelligence and comic craft that distinguished it from the more ordinary material produced around it. Swartzwelder contributed scripts to the show across many seasons of its run, and his episodes are among the most consistently cited as examples of what the show could still do in its later years when the right person was doing it, which is a piece of evidence both for the decline and for what the decline was a decline from. Dan Castellaneta's performance as Homer remained consistent across the entire run of the series in a way that the writing around him did not, which created an interesting condition in the later seasons where the voice actor was still finding and sustaining the character's specific emotional quality in his performance, even when the scripts were not providing him with material that required that quality. Castellaneta has said in interviews that he understands Homer well enough after decades in the role that he can find the character's genuine feeling in almost any scene the script requires, which is both a tribute to his relationship with the character and a description of what skilled voice acting can do when it is given less than ideal material to work with. The performance held something in place during the difficult years that the writing alone was not holding in place, providing a continuity of character that the episodes themselves did not always provide. The audience's response to the decline was measurable and has been measured across multiple dimensions. Ratings fell across the post-Golden Age seasons, though The Simpsons was never again the ratings phenomenon it had been in its early years, even during its creative peak, partly because the television landscape had changed enough that the specific cultural dominance the show had achieved in the early 90s was structurally unavailable to any single program in the more fragmented media environment of the early 2000s. Critical reception, which had been uniformly positive during the Golden Age, became mixed and then occasionally negative in ways that were novel for a show that had spent its best years as one of the most celebrated programs in American television. The online fan community, which grew substantially across the 2000s as the internet became a primary venue for organized fandom, developed its own detailed vocabulary for describing and analyzing the decline, including the specific terminologies of jerk Homer and Flanderization that have since passed into general use in discussions of long-running creative works. The show's response to its own decline has been complicated and in some respects admirable, acknowledging through its writing that the decline was real and that the character had changed from what he was, while being unable to fully reverse the change through acknowledgement alone. The show has produced episodes in its later seasons that are explicitly about Homer's limitations, that treat his selfishness and his impulsiveness not as comedy to be enjoyed, but as problems to be examined. And these episodes are more honest than the simpler jerk Homer episodes, but not necessarily more satisfying, because honesty about what a character has become is not the same as the character being what he was. What survived the decline, the thing that kept Homer Simpson a figure worth discussing, even after the specific version of him that the Golden Age had produced began to recede from the show's regular output, was the accumulated weight of what the Golden Age itself had produced. The Golden Age episodes continued to exist and continued to be watched in reruns and in the digital archives that have made them permanently available, and the Homer Simpson who lived in those episodes continued to be the Homer Simpson that the culture understood as the real one, the standard against which the later versions were measured and found lacking. The decline changed what Homer was on television from week to week. It did not change what Homer was in the collective memory of the audience that had watched the Golden Age, and collective memory turned out to be more durable than any particular season's writing room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The decline revealed what the Golden Age had actually been built on, and the distance between those two versions of the same character is the most precise measure of what the Golden Age achieved. Next comes what Homer Simpson meant culturally when the show was at its peak, and why a yellow cartoon man from a fictional American town became one of the most studied figures in the history of popular culture. Section 8. What Homer meant to the world. Homer Simpson did not become a cultural cultural institution through any deliberate campaign. No one sat in a room in 1989 and planned for a cartoon character to enter the Oxford English Dictionary, receive honorary citizenship from a Canadian city, or generate more than $16 billion in merchandise across 35 years. What happened instead was slower and stranger than any marketing strategy could have produced. A gradual accumulation of recognition from an audience that kept finding something true in the same yellow face across decades of completely changed circumstances. The most documentable single event in Homer's cultural penetration is the entry of dough into the new Oxford Dictionary of English in 1998, 9 years after the series premiered. The definition provided by the dictionary describes an exclamation used to comment on a foolish or stupid action, especially one's own, which is accurate as a dictionary definition needs to be, while being insufficient as a full account of what the sound actually does when people use it in practice. Dough carries the specific emotional quality of self-directed, mild frustration, arriving at the exact moment when it is too late to be useful. The recognition in real time that what just happened was the result of your own action, that the outcome could have been different if you had paid slightly more attention to the available evidence before committing to the course of action you committed to. It is a word for the precise gap between what you knew and what you acted on, a gap that exists in virtually every human life on a daily basis, and that most languages do not have a single convenient term for. The word traveled from Dan Castellanetta's improvised rendering of a stage direction reading "annoyed grunt" through the filter of Matt Groening's timing instinct, and then through 9 years of television broadcast into the official record of the English language, and from there into daily use by people who have never watched the show and who would not identify it as a Simpsons reference if asked. That specific journey, from a cartoon character's specific sound to a genuine word in active use across a language community, is not a journey that most invented sounds make, and the fact that this one made it is evidence of the depth of the cultural saturation the show achieved during its best years. When a fictional character's specific verbal production becomes a real word used by real people in real conversations about real situations, the character has crossed a boundary that separates cultural phenomena from the ordinary category of popular entertainment. Entertainment Weekly named Homer Simpson the greatest fictional character of the previous 20 years in 2010, a ranking that generated the usual debate about whether such rankings mean anything, while also generating a body of critical writing that, taken in aggregate, was more substantive about what the character had actually accomplished than most rankings produce. Groening, quoted in that context, offered a description of Homer that captured something essential about the character's specific complexity, saying that in the course of a single sentence, Homer was running an emotional obstacle course, moving through states of feeling with a speed and a specificity that most television comedy did not attempt, and that most television characters did not require. That description is worth sitting with, because a character running an emotional obstacle course in a single sentence is doing something genuinely unusual, and doing it with enough consistency that a writer who has spent decades creating and observing the character can describe it as a defining feature rather than an occasional achievement. It is also a description that explains why Homer generated such a substantial body of serious intellectual analysis. Because a character doing something that specific and that compressed is doing something that the tools of character analysis were designed to examine. The academic response to Homer Simpson and to the show around him during the Golden Age was extensive, sustained, and genuinely substantive in ways that the response to most television characters is not, and probably should not be. Books examining The Simpsons as a cultural, philosophical, and political text began appearing in the mid-1990s and continued to appear with regularity for the following 2 decades, addressing the show's engagement with American political culture, its relationship to postmodern irony and self-reference, its treatment of religious faith and institutional religion, its economic assumptions about working-class life, and its specific rendering of the American family as an institution that the show simultaneously affirmed and subjected to sustained satirical examination. Within these broader analyses of the show as a whole, Homer consistently attracted the most detailed and the most most theoretically ambitious treatment, because the character's apparent simplicity, the big, bald man who eats donuts and says "dough," concealed sufficient complexity to sustain genuinely serious examination without the examination being embarrassed by its own subject. A 1999 academic collection titled The Simpsons and Philosophy, published by Open Court and edited by William Irwin, Mark T. Conrad, and Eon Scoble, included an essay by Raja Halwani specifically examining Homer's relationship to Aristotelian ethics, asking whether Homer's pursuit of immediate gratification and his capacity for occasional genuine virtue could be coherently understood within the framework of eudaimonia, the Aristotelian conception of human flourishing that requires the cultivation of virtue through habit and a specific rational relationship between appetite and reason. Homer failed this test by every available measure. His relationship between appetite and reason is approximately the inverse of what Aristotle required, with appetite reliably winning the competition between the two in virtually every episode the Golden Age produced. But the failure was instructive rather than simply dismissive, because examining Homer against the Aristotelian framework produced a sharper and more precise account of what that framework actually required than most abstract philosophical discussions of Aristotle manage, by showing in vivid, specific, comedic detail what a person who did not meet those requirements looked like at the full expression of his specific qualities. Homer as a philosophical negative case study turned out to be as useful as Homer as a comedic protagonist, which is a specific kind of intellectual achievement available only to characters drawn with sufficient precision that they mean something when placed in contexts their creators never anticipated. The cultural analysis of Homer as an American everyman is the dimension of his meaning that generated the most sustained public discussion and the most persistent disagreement, because the specific relationship between Homer and the American working middle class that he was read as representing shifted across the decades of the show's run in ways that the character himself did not always shift to accommodate. During the Golden Age, Homer's relationship to the working middle class was genuinely representative in a complicated and honest way, acknowledging the real material and emotional conditions of that experience without either celebrating them uncritically as the natural expression of American virtue or condemning them from the position of comfortable distance that class-based satire often adopts, without acknowledging the distance it is operating from. Homer's job that was never quite enough to fully support the desires of his family, while being sufficient to prevent the family from sliding into a more obviously precarious condition. His house that required constant maintenance it did not always receive. His car that broke down. His community institutions that were simultaneously sustaining and constraining. All of it corresponded closely enough to the actual lived experience of a very large number of American households that the show produced in those viewers the specific quality of recognition that is different from simply finding something relatable. Recognition, in the sense being used here, is the experience of seeing something you know from the inside, rendered from the outside with enough accuracy and enough specificity that the rendering feels like confirmation rather than simply depiction. It is the experience of a representation that does not flatter or simplify, but that also does not condescend or caricature. A representation that holds what it is representing steady enough and clearly enough that the people who know it from their own lives can see it in the image without the image telling them what to feel about what they see. Homer, during the Golden Age, produced this quality of recognition in an audience that was enormous and diverse, crossing age ranges and income levels and educational backgrounds in ways that the show's demographics measured and that the show's critical reception confirmed. A 5-year study of more than 2,000 middle-aged adults conducted in France examined the relationship between body mass index and performance on certain memory tasks, finding what the researchers described as a possible correlation between elevated body weight and reduced word recall. The media coverage of this study adopted the term Homer's Simpson syndrome almost immediately, using the character's name as shorthand for the pattern the study had identified. This is a specific and revealing form of cultural absorption, the character becoming a label for a quality rather than a full person, his name traded as conceptual currency for a specific cluster of meanings without any necessary engagement with the character as a character. The adoption of Homer's name for a medical mathematical research finding is evidence both of how deeply he had penetrated the shared cultural vocabulary and of the specific reduction that high cultural penetration always risks: the flattening of a complex character into the single most legible trait, the trait that can be named quickly and understood instantly without any of the surrounding complexity that made the character worth the name in the first place. Homer became an honorary citizen of Winnipeg, Manitoba, in Canada in 2003, after Groening revealed during a public appearance that his own father, the real Homer Groening, had Canadian roots that traced to that region, making the fictional Homer technically Canadian by familial descent. The civic ceremony in Winnipeg, welcoming a cartoon character as an honorary citizen, is funny as an event, objectively and without any irony needing to be applied to it, but it is funny in the specific way that things which are also true are funny, where the humor and the genuine meaning coexist rather than the humor canceling the meaning. The feeling being expressed in the ceremony was genuine. The civic pride and the affection and the desire to claim connection to a cultural figure who had become important were all real, and the fact that the object of those feelings was a fictional yellow man made in Los Angeles was irrelevant to the reality of the feelings, which is itself a very precise description of what cultural figures are and what they do when they work. The show's international reach gave Homer's cultural penetration a geographic scope that exceeded any American television character before him, and most that have come since. The show aired in more than 60 countries, was translated into over 30 languages, and was watched in sufficient numbers and with sufficient consistency across different national audiences that the responses it generated in those contexts provided a natural test of which elements of Homer's comedy were culturally specific and which were universal. The results of that test were instructive. The jokes that depended on specifically American cultural knowledge did not travel as cleanly as the jokes that were built entirely from Homer's character and his situation, from the gap between who he was and what he wanted to be, from the specific texture of his relationship to his family and his workplace and his own limitations. The gap between aspiration and capability is not culturally specific. The hunger for something better than you currently have, while being unable to fully sustain the effort that something better requires, is not an American condition. It is a human condition, and Homer drew it precisely enough that the drawing was legible across contexts very different from the one it was drawn in. By 2024, the franchise that had begun with a family sketched in 15 minutes in a waiting room had generated more than $16 billion in merchandising revenue, a number that places Homer Simpson among the most commercially successful fictional characters in the history of entertainment. The commercial success and the cultural significance reinforce each other rather than existing in opposition. A character generates that level of commercial engagement because audiences want to maintain physical proximity to something the character represents to them, want to carry it into their daily lives in tangible form. The desire to maintain proximity is itself a precise measurement of what a character has come to mean. The sense that the character holds something worth keeping close, something true enough about human experience that having it nearby is a form of comfort or recognition, or both simultaneously. The specific combination of qualities that produced all of this, the dictionary entry, the academic essays, the honorary citizenship, the $16 billion, was not Homer's comedy alone, though the comedy was genuinely excellent. It was not the show's writing alone, though the writing during the Golden Age was some of the finest produced for American television. It was the specific relationship the character established with the people who watched him, a relationship built on the precise balance of his limitations and his goodness, the coexistence of genuine love and genuine failure within the same person across the same life, without either quality canceling the other. A character who was simply good would have been admirable and forgettable. A character who was simply stupid would have been a joke with no subject beneath it. Homer was both and neither, a man whose love for his family was real and whose capacity to act adequately on that love was perpetually insufficient, and the specific tension that produced was not resolved across 35 years of television, which is exactly why it remained generative for 35 years of television. The people who recognized themselves in Homer were not recognizing his donuts or his beer or his specific job in a specific fictional town. down. They were recognizing the gap, the universal human gap between the person they knew themselves to be capable of being and the person they were actually managing to be from day to day. The gap that everyone who has ever loved someone imperfectly knows from the inside. Homer made that gap visible and legible and funny without making it shameful, which is a specific act of generosity that fiction can perform for the people who encounter it, and that this fiction performed for an audience large enough to fill a significant portion of a planet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Homer's cultural penetration produced dictionary entries, academic philosophy, honorary citizenships, and $16 billion in merchandise, all evidence of the same underlying quality, a character drawn precisely enough to be recognizable as something true about human experience. Next comes the voice behind the character, and what Dan Castellaneta has built across nearly 4 decades of living inside the same person. Section 9. The voice that never left. Dan Castellaneta has been Homer Simpson for 38 years. He was in the room when the character was first given sound, present during the Tracy Ullman shorts when the voice was still searching for what it would become, and he has remained present for every subsequent version of the character across every season of the full series, through the Golden Age and through the decline, and through the gradual restabilization that followed the decline, through the theatrical film and the specials and the anniversary episodes and the crossovers. He is the only person who has ever voiced Homer in the main series, a continuity of performance spanning nearly 4 decades without any recasting or replacement, and the specific relationship between a performer and a character that kind of sustained inhabitation produces is genuinely unusual in the history of entertainment, belonging to a category of creative relationships that has very few comparable members. The voice itself is the first thing worth examining, because the voice is how Homer is communicated to anyone who has not watched the show, the thing that makes the character immediately present in a room, even without the animation, the way a single phrase delivered in Castellaneta's Homer register summons the full weight of the character, regardless of the context in which it is delivered. The voice is not a simple construction. It is built from multiple specific choices about pitch, resonance, pacing, and a quality of emotional openness that makes Homer sound simultaneously vulnerable and completely unaware of his own vulnerability. And understanding how those choices were made and how they have been maintained across nearly 4 decades of recording sessions reveals something important about what voice performance at this level actually requires. The pitch sits in the middle of Castellaneta's natural range, slightly lower than his own speaking voice and slightly more open in its resonance, producing a sound that carries a quality of slightly childlike directness while remaining recognizably adult in its weight and authority. The specific openness of the voice is its most essential quality, the thing that separates Homer's sound from a simple comedy voice, because it allows the character to express a very wide range of emotional states without the voice itself seeming to change registers in a way that would break the illusion of a single continuous person. Homer can be joyful and devastated and furious and tender and bored and terrified within the same episode, sometimes within the same scene, and the voice accommodates all of those states without any of them feeling like a performance within the performance, which is the specific failure mode of less well-constructed comedy voices, whose emotional range is limited by the distance between the vocal register chosen for comedy and the register that genuine feeling requires. A voice built only for laughs cannot carry grief. Castellaneta built a voice that could carry both simultaneously, which is exactly what the best Homer episodes required and what the lesser ones failed to fully use. Castellaneta's background before The Simpsons included significant work in improvisational comedy. He trained at the Improv Olympic in Chicago before relocating to Los Angeles, and the specific skills that improvisational training develops are all visible in what his Homer performance does at its best. The ability to respond genuinely in the moment, rather than executing a predetermined plan, the habit of finding real emotional engagement with whatever the current situation requires, the willingness to commit completely to a choice without knowing in advance that the choice is correct. These qualities belong to the training rather than simply to natural talent, and they are what give the Golden Age performances is their quality of spontaneous discovery, the sense of a performer finding something in the scene in real time rather than reproducing a reading he worked out at home before coming to the studio. The full cast recording sessions that Hillenburg insisted on from the beginning of the show's production were the structural condition that allowed this quality to express itself, placing all the performers in the same room so that their responses to each other could be genuine responses rather than carefully calibrated approximations of responses. And the comedy of timing in the best episodes is partly a product of real human interaction happening in a recording booth rather than simulated interaction assembled by an editor from separately recorded files. The story of Doe is the most documented origin story attached to any specific element of Homer's performance, partly because the sound became the character's most famous feature, and partly because the story of how it came to be is specific and verifiable in a way that origin stories for comedic inventions often are not. The scripts for the Tracy Ullman shorts contained a stage direction calling for an annoyed grunt at moments when Homer was required to express mild, self-directed frustration, and Castellaneta had to decide what that sounded like when produced by this specific character in this specific vocal register. His first instinct drew on something he had observed in Jimmy Finlayson, the Scottish character actor who appeared in more than 30 Laurel and Hardy films between the 1920s and 1940s, and who had developed a specific verbal mannerism as a substitute for profanity, a drawn-out expression of frustration that carried the emotional content of a stronger word without using the word itself. Finlayson's version was theatrical in its length, designed for live performance, where a certain expansiveness of expression was necessary to carry to the back of a room or to register through the relatively crude audio of early sound film. Castellaneta produced a version of this that retained the quality while extending the duration, something closer to a genuine moan of self-directed frustration. Groening heard the longer version and suggested shortening it, reasoning that animation's relationship to timing was more compressed and more precise than live performance's relationship to timing, that a sound running a half-second longer than the window it was designed for would miss the window entirely, landing after the comedic moment had passed rather than inside it. The suggestion was straightforward, and Castellaneta executed it, shortening the sound until it found the length at which it worked. The specific duration at which the percussive onset and the following vowel were in the right proportion to each other, funny enough to be comedy and genuine enough to be feeling, and brief enough to land inside the timing the animation required. The resulting sound was not calculated to become a word. It was calculated to be a correct piece of vocal timing inside a 60-second cartoon segment, and everything it subsequently became was a product of that correctness being applied across hundreds of episodes in enough different contexts that the sound accumulated the weight of a word before anyone had decided to treat it as one. The dictionary entry in 1998 was the confirmation of a process that had been underway for 9 years. By the time the new Oxford Dictionary of English added "doe" to its records, the sound had been used by Homer in more episodes across more situations than most genuine words are used in the same span of time, and it had been adopted by the show's audience for use in their own conversations about their own situations with enough consistency and enough geographic spread that the dictionary was simply documenting what had already happened rather than promoting a candidate. The definition provided, an exclamation used to comment on a foolish or stupid action, especially one's own, is accurate in the way that dictionary definitions need to be accurate, covering the core use cases without accounting for the specific emotional texture that the word carries in practice, the quality of self-knowledge arriving a moment too late, the recognition that the gap between what you knew and what you acted on has just produced a consequence. It is a word for the specific feeling of being your own problem, which is a feeling that Homer had made so thoroughly visible and so specifically familiar across 9 years of television that the language simply incorporated it. Castellaneta has also voiced a significant number of additional characters within the show's universe across its run, a dimension of his creative contribution that is sometimes overlooked in accounts focused primarily on Homer. Grandpa Simpson is the most substantial of these secondary performances, a character Castellaneta has built with the same sustained care and the same depth of internal understanding that he has brought to Homer, producing a voice and a presence for Grandpa that is fully distinct from Homer without being disconnected from him. The two characters audibly related in the way that fathers and sons are audibly related without sounding like the same person. The father-son relationship between Grandpa and Homer is not only a narrative relationship maintained through story and dialogue, but a performance relationship maintained through the specific way two voices built by the same performer are calibrated against each other. And Castellaneta's ability to be both of those people in the same recording session is itself a piece of craft that deserves more attention than it receives. Beyond Grandpa, the roster of additional characters includes Krusty the Clown, the squeaky-voiced teen, Hans Moleman, Arnie Pie, Bill and Marty, and dozens of incidental characters who populate the show's background without being credited to any specific performer. The range of vocal invention demonstrated across that roster is evidence of the breadth of Castellaneta's improvisational training as much as of any specific preparation for individual roles. The ability to generate distinct and fully realized characters on demand across a very wide range of ages, registers, emotional qualities, and comic sensibilities without any of them bleeding into each other or into Homer. A recording session for a single episode might require Castellaneta to voice Homer across multiple emotional states, then shift to Grandpa for a scene in the retirement castle, then shift to Krusty for a segment of a television show within the show, then voice an incidental character who has two lines in a crowd scene. The ability to keep all of those distinct and to locate each of them quickly when the recording moves to them is a form of vocal organization that improvisational training makes possible and that 4 decades of practice has made second nature. The recording sessions have been described by multiple cast members across the show's long run as one of the primary sources of its specific quality, and Castellaneta's accounts of what those sessions produce confirm this from the inside of the process. The difference between performing a character in a room with the other actors and performing the same character in isolation and then having the isolated recordings assembled is not simply a difference in the social experience of production. It is a difference in what the performance is able to do and find, because genuine response to another performer in real time produces moments that planned response to an audio file cannot produce. The specific rhythmic quality of the comedy in the best episodes, the way lines land against each other in a pattern that sounds like real conversation finding its own pace rather than scripted dialogue being executed to specification, is a product of those sessions and of the specific community of performers who have inhabited the same characters in the same room for nearly 4 decades. What 38 years inside Homer has given Castellaneta is a form of knowledge about the character that is genuinely different in kind from the knowledge the writers have, or the directors have, or the audience has, because it is knowledge built from the inside of performing Homer, rather than from any external vantage point on him. The writers know what Homer does. The directors know how Homer moves within the animation. The audience knows how Homer makes them feel. Castellaneta knows how Homer makes the decisions Homer makes, what the interior experience of being Homer feels like at the moment before Homer does the thing Homer does, which is the knowledge that a performer brings to a character that no other kind of relationship with the character provides. He has described this knowledge in the terms of Homer's emotional logic, the specific way the character processes the world and arrives at responses that are consistent with who he is across a very wide range of situations. And the consistency of that emotional logic across nearly 4 decades of episodes written by dozens of different writers is in significant part a product of Castellaneta maintaining it from the inside of the performance when the scripts were not fully maintaining it from the outside. The decline of the show in its post-Golden Age seasons created a specific professional challenge for Castellaneta that is worth acknowledging as a dimension of what the decline actually looked like from within the production. He was being asked to perform a character that the scripts were increasingly drawing as simpler and less emotionally nuanced than the character he had spent years developing, and the qualities that had distinguished his performance during the Golden Age, particularly the ability to find genuine feeling within comedy and to make that feeling coexist with the comedy rather than being separated from it, were being called upon less frequently because the comedy being written around him required less of them. His performances in the post-Golden Age seasons maintained more of the character's genuine complexity than the writing consistently demanded, which is evidence of how deeply Homer was embedded in Castellaneta rather than simply in the scripts, but it also meant that the best qualities of his performance were occasionally operating without material that was using them fully. A voice built to carry grief and laughter simultaneously is wasted on episodes that require only one of them. He was 66 years old in 2025 and had been performing Homer for 38 of those years, a proportion of a professional life given to a single character that is unusual in any performing art, and particularly unusual in voice acting, which tends to produce more fragmented careers as performers move between projects rather than sustaining a single ongoing engagement across decades. The physical and vocal demands of performance change across a 40-year span in ways that require continuous adjustment, and maintaining a character's consistency while accommodating the natural changes that time produces in a performer's instrument is a form of craft that only the longest careers demonstrate fully. He has said in multiple interviews across the show's milestone anniversaries that Homer continues to feel alive to him in a way that 4 decades of repetition might be expected to exhaust. The explanation he has offered is consistent with everything known about how the character was built during the Golden Age. Homer is alive to him because Homer is genuinely complex, because the emotional obstacle course that Groening described the character running in a single sentence is a real property of the character rather than a simplified description of it, and because a character with genuine complexity provides a performer with genuine resources to draw on, regardless of how long they have been drawing on those resources. A simple character runs out. The performer finds the edges of what it contains, and there is nothing left to find. A complex character continues to offer new access points, new angles from which its interior can be approached, new ways of being inside it that have not been fully explored because the interior is large enough and specific enough to contain more than any single run of episodes or any single decade of a show's history has called upon. That is the specific form of creative gift that Homer Simpson turned out to be for the performer who gave him his voice. A character complex enough to sustain nearly 4 decades of inhabitation without the inhabitation exhausting what the character contains. The gift has traveled in both directions. Homer is inseparable from Castellaneta's voice in the sense that no one who knows the character can think of him without hearing that specific sound, and Castellaneta's sustained commitment to the character across 38 years is inseparable from what Homer has remained across the full span of the show's history, a consistency of presence that the writing around him did not always match. The character and the performance have constituted each other in a way that makes the question of where one ends and the other begins genuinely difficult to answer, which is the specific condition that the longest and most committed creative relationships in the history of performance produce, and that this one has produced across a span of time that has no real precedent in the specific category of sustained voice performance for a single character in a long-running animated series. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The voice and the character have constituted each other across nearly 4 decades, and the performer who built that relationship has built it through the specific form of understanding that only sustained commitment produces. Next comes the final section, what Homer Simpson means now after 35 years of television, and what his entire story says about the specific kind of permanence that genuinely complex characters can achieve. Section 10. What he became. 35 years is a very long time for anything to remain in the world, and it is an almost incomprehensible amount of time for a single fictional character to remain continuously present in the cultural lives of the people who know him. Homer Simpson has been on television since December of 1989, which means he has now been part of American popular culture for longer than most of the people currently watching him have been alive, and longer than many of the institutions that shape American life on a daily basis have existed in their current form. The internet as a mass medium did not exist when Homer first appeared on a primetime network. The streaming services that now carry his reruns were not imagined. The specific social and political and cultural landscape that the show's early seasons were describing and satirizing has transformed so completely that the Springfield of the Golden Age reads partly as historical document, a precise rendering of a specific moment in American life that has since moved far enough away from that moment to be recognizable as period rather than contemporary. None of this has made Homer Simpson feel historical. He feels, to the people who know him across all three of the generations this video has examined, permanently present in a way that goes beyond simple recognition or brand familiarity into something closer to active cultural residence. That specific quality of permanent presence is worth examining carefully as the final subject of this video, because it is not a quality that all long-running fictional characters achieve, and it is not a quality that can be manufactured through longevity alone. There are characters who have been on television as long as Homer or longer who feel like products of their specific moment rather than permanent fixtures of the cultural landscape, characters who are interesting as historical artifacts and affectionately remembered by people who encountered them in childhood without feeling actively present in the way that Homer does, without the sense that encountering them now would produce something other than nostalgia. The difference between those characters and Homer is the difference between a character who was well executed and a character who was genuinely complex, and the specific form of complexity that Homer embodied during his best years is the thing that has made the difference between a character who aged gracefully into a piece of nostalgic television history and a character who has remained a living presence in the culture's ongoing self-understanding. The 35th anniversary of the show's premiere in December of 2024 generated the kind of coverage in entertainment media, fan communities, and mainstream press that reflects Homer's specific institutional status rather than simply his celebrity. Institutions are things that outlast the specific conditions that produce them and that continue to perform a recognizable function in the lives of the people who interact with them, even after the original reasons for those interactions have changed substantially. Homer Simpson is an institution in this sense. The lobby sketch, the Tracy Ullman shorts, the particular writing culture of the Golden Age, the specific historical moment of the early 1990s when the show reached its creative and cultural peak, none of those conditions still exist in the form they existed in when Homer was being built into what he would become. What exists is the character those conditions produced, carrying the specific qualities they deposited in him, still performing the function he was built to perform, which is the function of making a certain kind of truth about human experience visible and legible and funny in the specific proportions that allow the visibility and the legibility and the funniness to work on each other rather than against each other. The function has not changed, even as the conditions around it have. People who watch the Golden Age episodes now and people who watched those same episodes during their original broadcast experience the same recognition, the same specific sense of seeing something true about their own experience rendered in the image of a character whose experience is permanently located in the early 1990s. The recognition is not nostalgia in the simple sense of fondness for something past. It is recognition in the sense of seeing something accurate about one's own current experience rendered through a character whose world has been fixed in time for 30 years, and the fact that the rendering remains accurate across all those years of changed circumstances is evidence that what it was rendering was not specific to those circumstances, but was something durable underneath them, something that the specific circumstances of the Golden Age happened to make visible, rather than something those circumstances produced from nothing. The show reached its 35th season during the 2023 to 2024 broadcast year, an achievement that has no precedent in American primetime scripted television and that required a level of sustained institutional commitment from Fox and from the production company that goes beyond anything that could be attributed to the quality of any individual season or any particular run of episodes. The show has been renewed on commercial grounds as much as creative ones for many of its later seasons. The franchise's value as a brand and as a licensing property, providing motivation to continue production that is independent of whether any given season represents the show at a level approaching its best work. This is not a criticism of any particular later season individually, so much as an acknowledgement of the specific conditions under which very long-running entertainment franchises operate, conditions in which the commercial and the creative motivations for continuation become increasingly difficult to disentangle, and in which the question of what the show is for shifts gradually from the creative question of what it has to say to the commercial question of what it generates in revenue and brand value and sustained audience engagement. Homer's role within this franchise economy is complicated by the fact that he is simultaneously the primary creative subject of the show at its best and the primary commercial asset of the franchise at its most extended. As a creative subject, he requires complexity, ambivalence, genuine consequence, and the specific kind of emotional richness that Groening described when he said Homer was running an emotional obstacle course in a single sentence. As a commercial asset, he requires recognizability, consistency, and the stable delivery of the characteristics that his audience associates with him across decades of merchandise and promotional activity, which are primarily the appetite and the stupidity and dough rather than the more nuanced qualities that made those surface characteristics meaningful and moving in the Golden Age. The tension between those two requirements has been one of the defining pressures of the show's later seasons, and the later seasons' uneven quality is partly a reflection of that tension being resolved differently episode by episode, some episodes finding the creative version of Homer and others delivering the commercial version while being dressed in his visual design. The meme culture that has grown up around Homer across the decades of the show's run is a specific form of evidence for the character's cultural penetration that deserves examination as a distinct phenomenon. Memes built on Homer's image and on specific frames and moments from specific Golden Age episodes circulate continuously across the internet in quantities that show no meaningful decline, despite the material being more than 30 years old, which is itself a form of evidence that requires explanation. The specific frames most widely adopted and most continuously circulated: Homer backing away from a situation into the concealment of a hedge, Homer drooling over food, Homer's expression of specific forms of social discomfort or embarrassment, Homer's face at the moment of registering a piece of unwelcome information, are all frames from the Golden Age rather than from the later seasons. The persistence with which those specific frames circulate over frames and images from the later seasons is itself evidence of the Golden Age's specific quality. The fact that the comedy produced in those seasons was precise enough to be applicable to situations the writers of that comedy never anticipated, which is one of the marks of genuinely good comedy rather than simply effective comedy. When a Homer Simpson meme is applied to a contemporary situation that has nothing to do with Springfield or with nuclear power or with anything from the 1990s, it works because the specific emotional quality captured in the Golden Age frame is still accurate to the contemporary situation being illustrated. Homer backing away from social difficulty into a hedge communicates something about the specific desire to remove oneself from uncomfortable situations that is as accurate a description of human behavior in 2025 as it was when the episode first aired, because the desire to back away from things that are uncomfortable is not a culturally or historically specific desire. It belongs to the permanent human inventory of responses to difficulty and embarrassment, and the Golden Age captured it with enough precision that the capture remains useful across 3 decades of changed circumstances and across contexts the writers of that episode never imagined it would be applied to. What the entirety of Homer's story, from the lobby sketch in 1987 through the Tracy Ullman shorts, through the Golden Age, through the decline and the stabilization and the streaming era and the anniversary coverage and the 35th season and the ongoing continuous presence of his face in the culture's daily visual environment, reveals about the specific kind of permanence that fictional characters can achieve, is something that is easier to see from the outside of any single era than from within it. The permanence is not a product of longevity, though longevity has extended and amplified it. It is not a product of commercial investment, though commercial investment has maintained the vehicle through which it travels. It is a product of the specific precision with which the character was drawn during the years when the drawing was being done most carefully and most honestly. The years when the people writing him understood not just what he did, but why he did it. What that why meant about the human experience the character was mapping, and how those two things together could be made to produce something that was both genuinely funny and genuinely true, without the funniness compromising the truth, or the truth compromising the funniness. Characters achieve permanence when they are drawn precisely enough to illuminate something about the human condition that audiences continue to recognize in their own experience long after the specific circumstances of the character's world have become historical rather than contemporary. Homer was drawn with that level of precision during the Golden Age, and the precision has sustained the character across 35 years of continuously changed circumstances, because precision of this specific kind does not expire with the conditions that produced it. The gap between who someone wants to be and who they are actually managing to be does not narrow with the passage of time in ways that would make Homer's rendering of it less applicable. The hunger for more than the current moment is offering, and the appetite for the wrong things at the wrong time, and the love that is real, and the judgment that is perpetually inadequate to serve that love. These are not observations specific to any particular decade, or any particular version of the American working middle class, or any particular moment in the history of a television medium. They are permanent features of the human situation, rendered in the specific comedic language of a yellow cartoon man in a fictional American town, and Homer drew them permanently enough that they are still visible and still accurate in him 3.5 decades after he was drawn. The specific form of permanence that Homer has achieved is worth distinguishing from simpler forms of cultural longevity. There are characters who endure because they have been made culturally ubiquitous through commercial investment, whose faces are familiar to everyone, whether or not anyone has a genuine relationship to the creative work that produced them. Homer's face is certainly ubiquitous in this sense, appearing on enough physical objects in enough different countries that a person who had never watched a single episode could still develop a strong visual familiarity with what he looks like. But Homer's permanence is not primarily a product of that ubiquity. It is a product of the specific relationship between the character and the people who have encountered him through the actual creative work, the episodes themselves, and the specific quality of that relationship, its depth and its durability, and its resistance to being fully exhausted by familiarity is what makes him permanent in the sense that matters, rather than simply in the sense that can be measured in merchandise sales. Dan Castellaneta will not voice Homer forever, and the show will eventually end, either through the decision of the people responsible for producing it, or through the natural attrition of the cast, whose collective commitment to the work has been one of the primary forms of continuity the franchise has maintained across its entire run. When the show ends, Homer Simpson will join the category of fictional characters who no longer appear in new episodes, but who continue to live in the episodes that already exist. The category that contains every character whose original run has concluded, and whose continued presence in the culture depends on the sustained willingness of audiences to seek out existing material, rather than on the continued production of new material. The Golden Age episodes will remain accessible in that category for as long as anyone continues to want to watch them, which by every available measure of the show's current cultural penetration and its continued introduction to new audiences through streaming platforms is likely to be a very long time. The question of what Homer will mean after the show ends is a question that his history across 35 seasons already answers more fully than might be expected. What he will mean is what he has already meant for most of the years he has existed, which is the most precise rendering of a specific kind of ordinary human experience that American television comedy has produced. Not the funniest character in television history by every available measure, because that competition is genuine and the contenders are serious, and the ranking depends entirely on the specifics of how funniness is being defined and measured. Not the most universally loved character in the medium's history, because that category distributes affection across enough different kinds of characters and enough different emotional registers that no single character can claim it without significant competition. But the most precisely drawn rendering of the specific gap between human aspiration and human capability that the medium has produced, the most accurate image of what it feels like to love someone imperfectly across an entire life without the imperfection ever fully canceling the love, the most honest account of what a person looks like from the inside when they have been given everything they need to be happy and cannot reliably sustain the happiness anyway because the instrument through which they were supposed to sustain it is fundamentally unreliable, not through cruelty and not through indifference, but through the specific human condition of being better at wanting than at managing. Homer Simpson is not the best version of a person. He is not a model or an aspiration or a character designed to produce the specific kind of admiration that fiction can generate for characters whose qualities exceed those of the people watching them. He is, instead, the best possible rendering of what a person actually is, seen clearly rather than flatteringly, drawn precisely rather than charitably, made funny rather than made sympathetic through any softening of what he genuinely is. The genius of the character, which is the genius of the Golden Age writing that built him, is that the precision of the rendering produces sympathy without any softening, that seeing Homer clearly is enough to love him, because what is seen clearly in him is recognizable as something real about everyone who sees it, that the character's specific failures and specific hungers and specific incapacities are drawn accurately enough to produce the specific form of recognition that turns into the specific form of affection that makes a fictional character permanent. A man who loves his family and regularly fails them. A man who is capable of genuine feeling and regularly fails to act on that feeling. A man who has been given a life and consistently mismanages it, and just as consistently refuses to give up on it. A man who can see donuts and beer and the inside of his couch and his television screen with the full force of desire that most people reserve for things they have been told are worth desiring. A man who can also, in the right moment, with the right audience and the right writing behind him, see his daughter sleeping at her desk and cry, and see his wife standing at the window and feel something so specific and so real that no word smaller than love is adequate to it, and stand at the end of his driveway on a summer night and feel the specific satisfaction of having enough, the houses and the lights and the crickets and the family inside, which is the satisfaction that all of his appetites were always finally about, and that he was never quite able to sustain for more than a moment before some other appetite called him away from it. That is what Homer Simpson is, stated as clearly as it can be stated without reducing it to a formula he would not recognize as himself. He is not a formula. He is a specific person, drawn with sufficient precision that his specificity became universal, which is the specific alchemy that the best fiction performs when it is working at its highest level, and that this fiction performed across a handful of seasons in the early 1990s for an audience that grew large enough and diverse enough to ensure that the alchemy traveled far beyond the specific circumstances of its production. He was drawn in a lobby in 15 minutes by a cartoonist protecting something else, given a voice by a comedian trained in the comedy of genuine response, and made fully into himself by a room full of writers who cared enough about getting him right that they got him right in ways that have outlasted every individual season and every individual episode and every individual joke, leaving behind a character whose life continues to feel like something worth knowing about for as long as there are people willing to look at what he actually is and recognize in the looking something true about what they actually are. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.